Like, subscribe, and share weekly updates with the scary videos. Story 1. The Silent Shadow. Emma was in her second year of college and needed extra cash to keep up with tuition and rent. When her neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, asked her to dog sit for the weekend, it seemed like a great opportunity. Mrs. Callahan's dog, Max, was a retired police German Shepherd, a massive but calm dog. Emma loved dogs, and Max seemed like the perfect companion for a quiet weekend at the Callahan house, a cozy but older Victorian-style home. Mrs. Callahan left Emma with clear instructions, food for Max, and the keys to the house. "He's a good boy," she said, patting Max on the head. "But he's perceptive. If he starts acting up, pay attention." Emma nodded, not thinking much of it at the time. Emma arrived at the house with her overnight bag, greeted by Max wagging his tail. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. She fed Max and settled into the living room to study. Max lay at her feet, seemingly content. As Emma flipped through her notes, she noticed Max suddenly left his head. His ears perked, and he let out a low growl. Emma froze. "What's wrong, boy?" she whispered. Max stared intently at the corner of the room, where shadows from the old furniture merged with the dim light. Emma walked over and turned on the light, revealing only the antique grandfather clock ticking away. Max's growl softened, but he didn't relax completely. Shrugging it off as Max adjusting to her presence, Emma returned to her work. The next day, Emma decided to explore the house while Max followed her around. She admired the vintage decor and family portraits lining the walls. In the study, an old bookshelf caught her eye. The shelves were filled with dusty books, but one in particular seemed out of place. It was a small leather-bound diary with faded handwriting on the cover. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened the diary. The first few pages were filled with mundane entries about family life in the 1940s. Then, the tone changed. December 12, 1947. "He's watching again. I can feel his eyes on me from the shadows. I can't escape him, not even in my own home." Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine. She flipped through more pages, each one describing increasing paranoia and fear. The final entry was almost illegible, but one line stood out. "If you find this, leave before he takes you too." That night, Emma tried to dismiss the diary as an old resident's delusions. She sat up on the couch to watch TV, Max lying beside her. Around midnight, Max shut up, his ears erect, and stared at the hallway. Emma muted the TV. A creak echoed through the house. Emma's breath caught. "Is someone there?" She called out. No response. Max bolted toward the hallway, barking fiercely. Emma grabbed her phone and followed cautiously. Max stopped in front of the basement door, growling deeply. Emma hesitated. She'd never been in the basement and wasn't sure she wanted to start now. Steeling herself, Emma opened the door. The wooden stairs descended into darkness. Max barked furiously, refusing to step down. Emma shone her phone's flashlight, illuminating cobwebs and dusty shelves. "There's nothing here, Max," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Suddenly, the light flickered, and a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. Emma screamed, slamming the door shut and locking it. The next morning, Emma called Mrs. Callahan. "Has anything strange ever happened here?" she asked, her voice shaking. Mrs. Callahan sighed. "The house has its quirks. Max usually keeps things calm. He's good at sensing disturbances." Emma didn't feel reassured. That evening, Emma avoided the basement entirely. She decided to sleep in the guest bedroom upstairs. Max lay on the floor near the bed, his eyes constantly darting toward the door. In the middle of the night, Emma woke to the sound of scratching. It was coming from the hallway. She opened the door to find Max growling and staring at the attic ladder, which was now pulled down. She was sure it hadn't been earlier. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. Silence, Max barked and bolted up the ladder before Emma could stop him. His growls turned into whines. Emma climbed up after him, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The attic was cold and empty, except for a single rocking chair in the corner. It moved slightly, though there was no breeze. Max stood frozen, his tail between his legs, staring at the chair. Emma approached cautiously. A shadow shifted behind her. She turned quickly, but nothing was there. The next morning, Emma returned to the study and began searching for more clues. She found a box of old photos hidden behind the bookshelf. Among them was a picture of a man standing in front of the house, his face blurred unnaturally. On the back was scrawled, "He never left." Emma decided she couldn't stay another night. She called Mrs. Callahan to explain. "You're right to leave," Mrs. Callahan said gravely. "I've always felt something here, but Max keeps me safe." Emma packed her things quickly. As she left, Max barked loudly, standing by the door as if to warn her not to linger. Emma avoided the house after that weekend, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Mrs. Callahan eventually moved away, and the house sat abandoned. One day Emma walked past the property, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadow in the window. Max had been right all along. Something was watching, something that never left. Story 2. The Howling Forest. It was a cold December evening when Jake reluctantly agreed to dog sit for his friend Tom. Tom had invited Jake on a weekend camping trip in the nearby forest, but Jake had to decline. He'd just started a new job and couldn't take the time off. Instead, Tom asked Jake to watch his dog Bella, a massive Malamute with a thick double coat of fur. Bella was an energetic dog, but she was incredibly loyal and protective, qualities Jake admired. Tom assured him that she'd be easy to care for, and the prospect of a quiet weekend in the woods alone with the dog didn't seem like the worst idea. The house was an old cabin in the outskirts of the forest, surrounded by dense trees and a slow-moving creek. The air was crisp, and Jake had arrived just before dusk, knowing that the sun would set early. Tom had left Jake a list of instructions: feed Bella twice a day, give her a walk in the woods, and make sure she didn't wander off. The rest was up to him. When Tom left, Bella seemed to sense it. She barked once, looking up at the door, before walking over to Jake and sitting at his feet. There was something about Bella's intense amber eyes that unnerved Jake, but he thought little of it. After all, she was just a dog. Jake fed Bella her meal and settled into the living room to relax. The cabin was simple but comfortable rustic furniture, a stone fireplace, and windows that framed the surrounding forest. Bella lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws. The evening seemed to pass quietly enough. As the night wore on, Jake lit the fireplace and grabbed his phone to check the news. Bella, however, began to act strangely. She shifted on the floor, slowly rising to her feet and walking to the large bay windows. She stood there, staring into the darkened forest. Jake's eyes followed hers, but all he could see was the swirling mist creeping between the trees. The wind had picked up, causing the branches to creak and groan in the distance. "Bella, what's wrong?" Jake asked softly. Bella didn't respond, but her body tensed, her fur bristling. Then, out of nowhere, she began howling. The sound was deep and mournful, echoing through the trees. Jake couldn't help but feel a wave of unease wash over him. He'd heard wolves howl in the distance before, but this wasn't like that. Bella's howl seemed to carry an emotion that was both haunting and desperate. He stood up, walking to the window. Outside, the forest was pitch black. The howl continued, as if it were coming from deeper within the woods, though there were no signs of movement. "That's weird," Jake muttered to himself, but he tried to shake it off. It was probably nothing, just a wild animal. But Bella didn't seem convinced. She kept her vigil by the window, her eyes glued to the darkness. The next morning, After a restless night, Jake decided to take Bella for a walk in the woods. He needed some fresh air, and maybe some exercise would help calm Bella's nerves. He attached the leash to her collar and stepped outside, the cold biting at his skin as he made his way into the forest. The woods were eerily quiet. The wind had died down, and there was no sound other than the crunch of the snow beneath his boots. Bella led the way, her tail held high. They walked deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker and the ground more uneven. It wasn't long before Jake noticed Bella acting strangely again. She stopped at a small clearing and began sniffing the ground, growling softly. "Hey, what's wrong, girl?" Jake asked, kneeling beside her. Bella didn't respond, her growling growing louder as she paced back and forth. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance. Following her gaze, Jake saw nothing but the vast, empty woods stretching out in front of them. He tried to calm her, but the growls became more intense. "It's just a deer or something," Jake said, trying to reassure himself as much as Bella, but deep down, he could feel something was off. Suddenly, Bella bolted, pulling hard on the leash. She darted off into the woods, her powerful body cutting through the underbrush. "Bella!" Jake shouted, but the dog was already out of sight. Jake chased after her, running through the snow, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what had spooked her, but he wasn't about to let Bella get lost. The woods were dense and unforgiving, and he couldn't afford to lose her. After a few minutes, he stopped to catch his breath. He called out Bella's name repeatedly, but there was no response. The silence was suffocating. Then, just as he was about to turn back, he heard Bella's frantic barking in the distance. Without thinking, Jake sprinted toward the sound. Bella's barking led Jake to a clearing, and there, nestled among the trees, was an old cabin. It appeared abandoned, with ivy growing up its sides and moss covering the roof. There were no signs of recent human activity. The windows were boarded up, and the door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Bella stood in front of the door, barking wildly, her tail stiff with tension. Jake approached cautiously, his heart racing. "Bella, come on," he urged. The dog refused to move, instead staring into the darkness inside the cabin. Jake hesitated. There was something unsettling about the place. He stepped closer, peering through the open door. Inside, the cabin was a mess of broken furniture, old newspapers scattered on the floor, and rusted tools left behind. But it was what he saw near the back wall that made his stomach churn. At first, Jake thought it was just a shadow. But as he stepped closer, he realized it was a human figure, sitting hunched over, its back to him. The figure's face was obscured by long, matted hair. It didn't move, as if frozen in place. "Who's there?" Jake called out, but the figure didn't respond. Bella started barking even louder, her voice filled with panic. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, but he was rooted to the spot. He glanced at Bella, who was now pulling on the leash, trying to get away from the cabin. Then, without warning, the figure turned its head slowly toward Jake. The face that stared back was pale and gaunt, with hollow, empty eyes. It grinned at him, revealing jagged, rotting teeth. Jake's heart stopped in his chest. Without thinking, he grabbed Bella and bolted out of the clearing, running as fast as he could through the forest. Behind him, the figure's laughter echoed through the trees, as though it was following them. Jake and Bella didn't stop running until they reached the cabin. When they finally returned to the house, Jake locked all the doors and windows, his hands trembling. He sat by the fire, trying to catch his breath, but the image of that figure kept replaying in his mind. The sound of Bella's frantic barking, the laughter echoing in the distance, it all felt so real. That night Jake didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear the wind howling outside, and with it, the faintest whisper of a voice calling his name. The last thing he remembered before the dawn broke was Bella's low growl, rising from the corner of the room. When the sun finally rose, Jake gathered his things and prepared to leave. He called Tom and told him everything. Tom was silent for a moment before replying, "I thought you'd stay away from there. That cabin, it's been abandoned for decades. But people still talk about it." "Talk about what?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "The man who lived there," Tom replied. "Some say he's still out there, wandering the woods, waiting for anyone who dares to come too close." Jake didn't wait for another word. He grabbed Bella and left, never looking back. As they drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was just a dark shape in the distance, but he could have sworn he saw something moving in the window. And Bella, who had been so calm before, was growling softly under her breath. Story 3. The Watcher in the Window. Sophia had just moved into the small town of Hollow Creek, a place that was quiet enough to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. She'd found a small, old house near the edge of town, nestled in a peaceful neighborhood. The house was charming weathered wood siding, a white picket fence, and a sprawling yard that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it had character, and it was perfect for her and her small budget. Her neighbor, Mrs. Green, was a sweet elderly woman who lived next door with her dog, Hazel. Hazel was a quiet, scruffy little terrier that would often bark at Sophia as she passed by, though she'd always seemed to settle down when Sophia spoke to her. Mrs. Green had no family in town, and it seemed that the little dog was her only companion. They quickly became acquainted, and when Mrs. Green asked Sophia to dog sit for the weekend while she traveled to visit family, it seemed like an easy favor to repay her for the occasional chats they'd shared over the fence. "I know it's short notice, dear," Mrs. Green had said, "but I trust you with Hazel. Just make sure she doesn't wander off, and be careful of the back door. Sometimes it sticks and doesn't close all the way." "It's an old house, you know," Sophia, eager to help, agreed. Hazel was a sweet dog, and it would only be for a few days. What could go wrong? Sophia arrived at Mrs. Green's house around 5 in the evening, just as the sun was starting to set. The house was a cozy, modest place with a faint smell of lavender that lingered in the air. Hazel greeted her enthusiastically at the door, wagging her tail and bouncing on her little paws. After a quick walk around the yard, Sophia settled in for the evening, feeding Hazel her dinner and making herself comfortable in the living room. She flipped on the TV, trying to relax after a long day of unpacking in her own home. As the night wore on, she noticed Hazel's behavior becoming increasingly strange. The dog had settled down on the couch beside her, but every few minutes she'd sit up, ears perked, and stare at the large bay window that dominated the front wall of the living room. Sophia thought it was odd but didn't think much of it at first. Hazel would occasionally bark at the passing cars or other animals, but this time it was different. Hazel's gaze was intense, fixated on something outside the window that Sophia couldn't see. Sophia glanced outside, but the street was empty, the street lights casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. "It's just the darkness," she muttered to herself, but Hazel's steady gaze made her uneasy. The dog continued to stare for what felt like an eternity, growling low in her throat, though she made no move to bark. Sophia got up, checked the locks on the door, and decided to call Mrs. Green to ask about the dog's behavior. But just as she reached for her phone, the sound of Hazel's whine broke the silence. The dog had backed away from the window, standing rigidly by Sophia's feet, staring at the door with wide, fearful eyes. "Is there someone out there?" Sophia wondered aloud. But when she peeked through the blinds, she saw nothing. The street remained deserted, a chill ran down her spine. Later that night, after Hazel had been walked again and fed, Sophia settled into bed, hoping to get some rest. Hazel curled up on the floor next to the bed, as she usually did at Mrs. Green's house. Despite the dog's strange behavior, Sophia tried to push her unease aside and fall asleep, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time Sophia began to drift off, she was jolted awake by the sound of scratching at the bedroom window. It wasn't a loud noise, more like the faintest scrape of something, perhaps a branch or something small brushing against the glass. But it was enough to make her sit up, heart pounding. She got out of bed and crossed the room, cautiously opening the blinds to see if there was anything there. At first, all she could make out was the darkness of the yard. Then her eyes fell upon the bay window, the same one Hazel had been staring at earlier. For a split second, she thought she saw something move in the corner of the window. It was too quick to be sure, but something was definitely there. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the window, then froze when she heard it, a faint tapping. Light, almost imperceptible, coming from the window. Someone was out there. She could see the outline of a person, their shadow faintly visible through the heavy curtains. They were standing just beyond the window, too still, too quiet. Sophia's heartbeat quickened. She swallowed hard, unsure whether to call the police or confront whoever was outside. She grabbed her phone but hesitated. If she called for help, they might be gone by the time anyone arrived. Hazel's growl broke the silence, low and guttural, the dog's hair standing on end. The sound was primal, like a warning. Sophia glanced at Hazel, whose eyes were wide and fixed on the window. It was then that she realized the figure outside was looking in, and they knew she was there. Terrified, Sophia backed away from the window, clutching her phone. She locked the bedroom door, trying to quiet her panicked breaths. Her mind raced. Should she try to escape through the back door, the one Mrs. Green had warned her about? But it would mean running through the yard, and possibly right into whoever was outside. Another tap on the window, louder this time, followed by a voice, a hoarse whisper that made her blood run cold. "Let me in." Sophia felt paralyzed. The voice was strange, guttural, and seemed to come from the person outside the window. But it didn't sound human. It was wrong, distorted. Hazel, still growling, bolted to the door, pawing at it, as if to protect her. But the door was locked. There was no way out. Sophia's mind raced for a plan. Her first instinct was to hide, but she couldn't leave Hazel alone with that thing out there. As she stood there, trying to figure out her next move, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps moving away from the window. A brief silence fell. Then the doorbell rang. It was so quiet that she almost didn't hear it. But when she did, she felt her chest tighten in fear. The person outside had moved to the front door. Without thinking, Sophia rushed to the back door, fumbling with the lock. She could hear the faint sound of someone breathing just outside, but she didn't dare look back. She had to get out. As she turned the handle, Hazel barked loudly from inside, a frantic and desperate sound. The back door opened, and Sophia dashed into the yard, the cool night air slapping against her face. She ran toward the fence, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the gate, she dared to look back one last time. There in the dark window, she saw the figure once more, but this time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't a person at all. It was a mannequin. The figure standing in the window was nothing more than a lifelike, hollow-eyed mannequin, standing eerily still. But the weirdest part, the mannequin had been placed there just moments before, and someone had been watching her through it. Sophia never stayed in the house again. The police later confirmed that the previous tenants had reported strange occurrences involving the mannequin, but they had never been able to explain it. Mrs. Green had been completely unaware, but when Sophia confronted her, the elderly woman merely nodded solemnly. "I knew that house was cursed," Mrs. Green said, her voice quiet and distant. "But Hazel always kept it away ... until now." Sophia moved out the very next week, leaving behind the house and the memory of the watcher in the window. But she would never forget the cold, hollow stare of those mannequin eyes, staring back at her from the darkness.